This twist might be even bigger than the high school catfish twist. Just trust me, you are in for a wild ride. In true crime, even the smallest little pieces of evidence matter. A tiny puzzle piece fits in to show you the bigger picture. These are the stories of the little pieces of evidence that end up solving a true crime case. Today is the green sweater. In November of 2023, 43-year-old Kristil Krug began receiving messages from her ex-boyfriend. His name was Anthony, and at first, the first message that came through said that he was going to be in the area and wanted to know if Kristil wanted to hook up with him. Kristil ignored the message. She was a happily married woman. She had 3 children. Her life was pretty good. She was very involved in her kids' life, very into being the greatest mom that she could be, and she did love her husband. Her and Daniel Krug had been married for 16 years. So she just ignored the message, kind of went on about her day. But the following day, the message wasn't even about the hookup or about a relationship or even kind. The message was extremely angry, almost as if he was mad at Kristil for rejecting him. It began just belittling her, saying horrible things to her, and then also telling her to commit Susie on herself. And this was extremely unusual because Kristil and Anthony's relationship, or lack thereof, kind of started a long time ago. Actually, Kristil was Anthony's very first girlfriend. They dated for a little while. It was only like a few months long. It wasn't super serious. And then they broke up. And every couple of years, they would say hi to each other, check in, how are you doing? I'm doing good, how are you? But it was never anything wanting to hook up or as horrible as the messages she was getting now. Kristil was surprised. I think she was probably disappointed in this person's actions, but she also just kept ignoring them. Because what do you do when someone is just so angry and you literally don't know this person? Because what you did know was so many years ago, and it seems that this person is a completely different person. It seems like this person isn't even what she thought Anthony was like. But the messages just came more and more. In these messages, they ended up saying that they had put her number on a site to have men write into her and hook up with her and do horrible things with her that she was not at all consenting to. And so now not only was she getting messages from Anthony, she could and did get messages from other men as well, wanting things that she didn't want. And then the messages started getting more threatening. They were threatening to her, and they were threatening to her husband, Daniel. And one day there was a message of Daniel, and it was a photograph of him getting into or out of his car at his workplace. This was absolutely terrifying because now not only does Anthony know about Daniel, he knows pretty much everything about Daniel. He is tracking him. He is not only stalking Kristil, he is stalking Daniel as well. And I think that really scared Kristil to see that there was threats being against her husband, because she was worried for her husband, her, and her children, who were old enough to understand kind of what is going on. And she was worried that this person might be stalking them too, because this was full-on stalking behavior. Not only was she being electronically stalked by her cell phone movements and having to constantly worry if she's going to get a text message. It's psychological war pretty much when you have a stalker like that. And so she was going through that. And then he, knew where Dan was. He began tracking her and saying things to her about her movements. She went to the dentist And he wrote and said, I saw you at the dentist today, and it was an obscure message. And that level of fear, I don't think I will ever understand fully hopefully it never happens to me, but just not knowing where this person is, if they're watching you, if they're going to do something. So Kristil had had enough. That was the last straw. She decided to go to the police, and she took this very seriously. This wasn't flirting or even friendly talk back and forth. He was threatening her. He was stalking her. She had the proof. So police took a report. It was going to be a while, and they told her that. Stalking cases are not only very hard to prove and prosecute, but they're a little hard to track down, especially in Kristil's case, because this person was using an app to text. And so even being able to track the data, it was going to be a process. But Kristil wasn't going to just give up. She decided to hire a private detective on her own to go out and try to find Anthony and stop this behavior from happening. And she wanted to take that information and turn it over to the police to make a case that this was serious. The private investigator that Kristil hired did end up tracking down Anthony, and he lived 500 miles away in Utah. And not that a stalking case doesn't happen from miles away, but this was just so odd that he did live so far. And she knew that he possibly could be around. And she had that picture. He was following her. She knew he was in Colorado, and that was even scarier. She gave all of the information that the private detective found over to police, but police pretty much did nothing because there wasn't much that they could do. They didn't have enough information to get any kind of search warrant for his home or electronic devices. They didn't have enough or anything to go after Anthony. And it was very disappointing because in stalking cases like this often happens where it's so threatening. It is interrupting your daily life. But police say until they do something, there's nothing we can do. And so for Kristil, it was like, okay, I'm sitting back and I'm waiting for someone to unalive me for police to take any action. And I think that's how a lot of victims feel. Kristil and Dan were terrified. They ended up putting up security cameras pretty much all over their property. Kristil was in tears most of the time. She didn't feel safe. She was looking over her shoulder. And this once very interactive mom kind of stepped away from doing a lot of activities where her kids were because she was worried about them. She could lead Anthony straight to her children. And then something extremely strange happens. The day starts pretty normally, as most days do in this house. Kristil gets the kids up and ready, and Dan takes them to school on his way to work. On the way to work, Kristil texted her husband, Dan, and said, can you pick up the kids from school? I have a meeting with the police officer, and I need you to pick them up. He replies, well, what time do I need to be there? And then silence. Kristil doesn't answer. And that's odd, but he waited for a while trying to see, okay, maybe she is doing something and she's going to get back to me. But he tried calling her and she didn't pick up. He tried texting her multiple times, calling her multiple times, and it just rang. And in this situation, especially with a stalker being right there, Dan immediately calls police. He called 911 and he said, I want a welfare check done on my wife. We are in this case. He explains everything and says, I cannot get a hold of my wife. Someone needs to go by and check on her. So they send an officer out. And when I say good police work, this police officer really did do the thing. He went to the front door first, rang the doorbell, nothing. Kind of like looked kind of around, looked in the windows. Maybe she was doing something else. didn't see any movement at all. Well, he thought in his mind, and in an interview he even said, I thought maybe if I saw her car in the garage, I could, proceed trying to get into the home or trying to get a hold of someone. But if her car isn't there, she probably isn't home. So he goes over to the garage, and the garage is interesting because it has windows across the top. But when he tries to look in, he's not tall enough to do so. And this is all caught on security camera. He pulls his cop car up to the garage and uses his cop car to look into the window. And that is just doing good police work, doing and caring about victims. And if he wouldn't have done that, I don't know what would have happened. A lot of cases where they go to the door and no one answers, they just walk away, but not this police officer. So he goes and he sees into the window and he immediately sees a woman lying on the garage floor. It was Kristil, and she was covered in blood around her head. And what had happened to her was absolutely horrendous. She was hit in the back of the head, unconscious, and struck by what we don't know of an object because it wasn't at the scene. Then whoever did this flipped her over and stabbed her once in the heart. This was frightening because not only was the police officer there trying to work on Kristil, trying to maybe possibly get her back, but her mom had showed up. Her mom had seen this. And then they heard screams, and it was Dan. It was Daniel. He was running down the road trying to get to Kristil, and police intervened and told the family right then and there that they could not get Kristil to come back, and she was unalived. Now, I feel like the police had this moment where they were like, okay, race is on. We have to get to Utah. We have to find out where Anthony is. This is such a pressure moment where it's like, we have to find him. We don't know if he's going after Daniel. We don't know if he's going after the kids. We don't know what's going to happen next. And they had no doubts in their mind that it was Anthony. He had been stalking Kristil. He knew her every moment, and he could have known that her husband wasn't home, especially if he is tracking or following her husband. And I think it just goes to show you the links that people can go to, and it's just so, so scary. But they couldn't find Anthony anywhere in Colorado because he was at his home in Utah. So they go to the door. Colorado police called Utah police. Utah police showed up at Anthony's door. They asked him a few questions. Do you know Kristil Krug? He said, yes, I do. And they asked him, when was the last time that you talked to her? And he said, it's been years. Now, I know what you're thinking. There's absolutely no way that he didn't do this because Anthony had to have been the person who did this. There was no other person who would have gone to this length to do this. But Anthony came off very confused. He came off very much like he had no idea what was going on. He said he did not have any contact with her and he did not do this. And he said, I can prove it. See, Anthony had an alibi and a pretty strong one. He had gone that day shopping with his wife at a local Kohl's store. He pulled out a receipt from that day, said, look, I was at Kohl's. I had bought something at 12:16 p.m. and it was a green sweater. So Kristil was attacked at 8 a.m. and Utah was an 8-hour drive. There was no way it could have been Anthony. And Anthony started showing lots of proof. He showed his work records. He said he was nowhere near Kristil in years. I mean, this was an old girlfriend, his first girlfriend. And yes, they'd talk a few times, but never like this. He pulled out his phone and nothing was on that. And I know what you're thinking because I thought it too. It had to be a burner phone, but there was nothing there. There was not any evidence that Anthony was anywhere near Kristil. But this story is far, far from over. Because if Anthony was in Utah buying a green sweater, who did this to Kristil and why? So they started looking at the evidence at the home, and this all unwrapped pretty quickly because they were starting to see that there wasn't any forced entry into the home. This family had cameras everywhere. So they decided to check the cameras. But unfortunately, the cameras weren't working at the time. Well, at least they thought. The cameras had been turned off manually. And the one on the porch, their Ring doorbell camera, had a little piece of blue painter's tape over the camera. So that was kind of a dead end. They didn't know who did that, because who could get into this house so stealthily? The two items even used to unalive Kristil were never found, and I don't know even what they were. They said that there was something to her head, but I don't even know if they know what hit her in the head. So they got their electronic investigators on the case, and they did a lot of digging into the stalker's text. And it seems that messages that were sent to Kristil from that texting app had a specific IP address. And it came back that it was a burner phone. It was a burner phone, and it was purchased in someone's name. I'm speechless. But just before I reveal to you who bought that burner phone, I want to say that these messages came back from a specific IP address. And that IP address was in Colorado. And so now you have the person who did this bought the burner phone. They had a specific IP address. So that's two pieces of evidence right there. And you'll never believe, ever, who was actually doing this. See, that specific IP address came back to Daniel's work. And Daniel was the person who bought the burner phone. See, it was Daniel all along who was sending those messages. That first message, that hookup message, was from her husband. And all the pictures, all of the stalking, all of the harassment came straight from her husband. He even took this picture himself. And if Dan was the stalker, there's a great possibility that he is also the unaliver. So did Kristil get bludgeoned to death in her own home and then stabbed in the heart by her own husband? And I think police were wondering what the motive was this whole time. Why would Daniel go to this lengths? And why would he even start stalking her to begin with? Well, here's the thing. Kristil and Daniel's relationship was getting very toxic. It was to the point where Kristil didn't really want to stay in her marriage anymore. Daniel's temper was pushing Kristil away. She had told friends and family that she was thinking about filing for divorce, and then those text messages came in. The belief is that Daniel started the text messages to try to get his wife to stay with him. And I know what you're thinking, that doesn't make any sense, but in the grand scheme of things, just look at it from his perspective. And I know that's very hard to do, but Daniel was losing his wife. He was possibly going to lose his kids, and he just didn't want her to leave him. And so they think that he created this whole thing with her ex-boyfriend as a way to be her knight in shining armor, to save her, to protect her, so that maybe Kristil will fall in love with him again. And it's horrible, it's horrendous, not the way to get somebody back. But in his own mind, I think he thought he was getting her to love him again. But then why go to the extent of unaliving her? Well, I think that Kristil was beginning to suspect Daniel was doing the stalking. And if Kristil found out that it was Daniel, it could ruin everything. He could go to jail for the stalking. He could definitely lose his kids and lose Kristil and lose even more than if it was a divorce. And so the only thing he could think of to do is try to frame Anthony for doing this. He looked up searches on his work computer that said things like what happens to you if you're knocked unconscious, how long people stay unconscious, and how hard is it to unalive from trauma to the head. These weren't just thoughts in his head. He was going through with a plan. In April 2025, Daniel went on trial for the unaliving of his own wife. The defense argued that there was no real evidence, that there was no bloody clothing. The items that were used in this, they couldn't find. There was no blood on the vehicle, but the jury decided that they didn't buy that and found him guilty. Guilty of unaliving and of stalking. He got life in prison without parole. And yet there Anthony sat in his green sweater. And that green sweater was just a little piece of evidence. It was just a little piece of the puzzle. Without that sweater, we wouldn't have known that Anthony was not the person who did this. And honestly, if he didn't have an alibi, he could have looked really good for this crime. And I really think that that green sweater was the little piece of evidence that ended up solving this case. January is National Stalking Awareness Month. And we hear that all of these things have months and we really don't pay attention and we really don't think about what they really mean. Stalking can start out of nowhere and be a slow burn, kind of like with Kristil. It can start and just be a few sentences, and then it just escalates into something so much more and so much scarier. Stalking can come from anyone. It can come from a family member. It can come from a stranger. It could come from a coworker, and it can even come from your spouse. And stalking can be many things, but what I will say and what I really want you to hear is that stalking escalates. It starts as a text message. It starts as maybe them following you or saying things that are uncomfortable to you. But then it gets worse. And a lot of times with these cases, the police don't do anything. Sometimes they can't do anything. Sometimes they don't believe that stalking is such a threat that it is. Stalking is not something to take lightly. It is not something that's just a friendly thing or a flirty thing. Stalking is a serious, serious thing. And like what we saw in Kristil's case, it can escalate into something much bigger. I know that when something like this is happening, you don't feel like you have anyone. You don't feel like you can do anything. But I will say one of the biggest things that I have learned is to take notes on everything. Document everything. Times, calls, numbers, take pictures if you can, video if you can, screenshot things if you can. Like, you need to have the evidence to take to police. And tell people about this. Tell your friends, tell your family. Try to keep yourself bigger in numbers. And if you feel safe enough to go to the police, please do. If you feel like you can't, I understand that too. Your safety is number one priority. You're not crazy. You are not overreacting. This is a serious crime. This is serious and it can escalate. And no matter who tells you that something might just be a little thing, it's not. Your privacy, your peace, your safety, your life matters. I'm going to put some resources down below as well as on this video. Please reach out to any of them. If you don't feel comfortable going to the police, you can go to some of these resources and they will help you. This story showed that it could be anyone. It could be a wealthy person, a not wealthy person, any race, religion, even gender. Stalking is so terrible, and there is resources that you can get for this. You are worth it. Take the time to make yourself safe because you are worth being here. And this could escalate to unaliving. In the end, for this case, it wasn't a confession, it wasn't luck. It was a small piece of the puzzle that ended up making a bigger picture. It was one piece of small evidence that refused to stay silent. In this case, it was just a green sweater. But what will it be in the next case? Please click subscribe to hear more. This is my podcast, Code 187, Missing Pieces. You can find me wherever you get your podcasts, as well as across social media. Be safe, be kind, and I will see you in the next one.